I had been planning the hike for weeks. It was early September, the air crisp but not cold, the kind of weather that made the forest smell sharp and alive. My friend and I had chosen a lake that was a few hours off the main trailhead, accessible only by a narrow, twisting path that promised isolation. We wanted to camp there, away from people, where the water was still enough to mirror the trees along the shore. The hike in had been quiet, the kind of silence that presses on you when no one else is around. The trail wound through pines and oaks, leaves scattered in mottled patterns of sunlight. Every so often, we'd hear the soft snap of twigs, not our own, and the occasional splash of water far below suggested the lake was close, though hidden by underbrush and fallen logs. We reached the clearing just before the sun touched the horizon. The lake lay beyond a low rise, the surface glassy, reflecting the deep oranges and reds of the sky. We picked a spot near the water but far enough from the shoreline that we wouldn't wake up damp from morning condensation. The ground was soft with moss, but firm enough to hold our tent. While my friend unpacked and began setting the tent poles, I walked toward a pile of dry wood I had spotted earlier, a little up the slope where branches had fallen in a tangle. The smell of damp pine and wet earth was heavy, and the sound of the wind through the trees was constant, a low murmur that wrapped around me. I gathered branches and split logs, balancing them against my shoulder, feeling the weight and the rough bark against my palms. Time slipped quietly by. The sun fell behind the far trees, the shadows stretching across the ground until the forest became a deep green, almost black. The lake glinted faintly in the twilight, its stillness holding the fading light like a promise. I tightened my grip on the firewood and made my way back, expecting the usual signs of a campsite. The tent upright, the small pile of gear, the faint smell of smoke starting from a fire pit. I froze the moment I saw it. The tent was slumped, one side nearly touching the ground, the poles bent awkwardly as if pressed from outside. Our backpacks were open and scattered, some items missing. The food we had carefully packed into a cooler and small bags was gone. The fire pit had no embers, not even a hint of smoke or ash. It was cold, abandoned. My stomach tightened. The clearing felt wrong. The light had dimmed to a dull blue, and the shadows seemed heavier, thicker around the edges of the trees. My friend was inside the tent, lying back on the sleeping pads, pretending. I realized that nothing was unusual. His posture was rigidly casual, a stiffness that didn't match the relaxed atmosphere we had maintained earlier. He hadn't moved since I returned. The weight of the firewood in my arms felt sudden and meaningless. I set it down, stepping closer, scanning for footprints, marks in the dirt, anything that could explain what had happened. There were none. The soft ground showed no tracks apart from ours, and no sign that anyone had passed through. The food and supplies were gone, vanished, and yet the tent's flap had been torn and poles bent without obvious cause. We packed up the tent quickly, my hands trembling slightly, the sound of zipper teeth scraping against each other unnaturally loud in the quiet. My friend didn't protest. He moved methodically, almost detached, folding the fabric and collapsing the poles. I kept glancing at the clearing as we worked. There was nothing unusual. No footprints, no discarded items. But the atmosphere was oppressive, the air thicker, colder in the fading light. Once the tent was secured and backpacks slung over our shoulders, we started down the trail, moving faster than we had on the hike in. The crunch of leaves underfoot was sharper, somehow more urgent, and the wind had picked up, rattling branches overhead in a way that made the forest feel alive. It took only an hour to reach the car, though the path felt longer, as if the forest itself had grown in the time we were in the clearing. I kept replaying the scene, the slumped tent, the missing supplies, my friend's strange calm. Nothing fit together. On the drive back, the roads were nearly empty, the sky fully dark now, and the headlights carved long rectangles of light into the trees that leaned toward us from either side. I tried to calm myself with the thought that maybe we had simply misremembered where we left the supplies, that we had somehow overlooked them in the dimming light. But the image of the collapsed tent refused to leave my mind. It wasn't until I reached home, unpacking the car, that I realized something crucial. I had left my own backpack at the campsite. My stomach sank. Everything in it, water, snacks, my camera, my journal, was still there. The thought of returning made my chest tighten. I called the ranger station first thing the next morning, explaining the situation, describing the clearing, the lake, the trail. Their response was slow, deliberate. After a pause, the ranger said no one had camped there in months. The lake had not been visited, at least officially, since late summer. The site I described was not registered as an active campsite. The maps showed no maintained trail leading there at all, only overgrown paths that were considered unsafe and largely impassable. I drove back, retracing the trail as best as I could, but nothing looked familiar. The slope where I had gathered firewood was overgrown, the clearing I had chosen for the tent completely obscured by fallen branches and underbrush. There was no trace of a campsite, no marks in the dirt, no flattened grass, nothing to indicate that anyone, including myself, had ever been there. It was as if the place had never existed outside of memory. I spent the better part of the morning walking in circles, calling the ranger on a second line, trying to describe landmarks, but the forest offered only confusion. The lake was still there, calm and glassy, but the surrounding area was impenetrable, overgrown with brush and fallen trees. There was no clearing where I could have set a tent. I never found my backpack. I never learned why the tent had collapsed or why our supplies were gone. The experience stayed with me, a weight that lingered at the edges of every outdoor trip I took afterward. Hiking, camping, even simple walks through familiar trails made me check and double-check the area, watch the trees for subtle changes, for anomalies. Every time I told the story to someone else, I avoided the part about the ranger saying no one had been there. It felt impossible, absurd, and yet every detail I remembered. The smell of the damp pine, the reflection of the sunset on the lake, the collapsed tent, was as real as the cold that pressed against my skin that night. Eventually, I accepted that the lake clearing we had camped at had vanished in some way, reclaimed by the forest, or perhaps it had never existed as we had perceived it. The only thing I could hold on to was the memory, the sharp clarity of the setting sun over the lake, the weight of the firewood in my arms, and the sudden wrongness of the campsite that should have been familiar. The uncertainty of what I had seen, combined with the impossible confirmation from the rangers, left a mark that never fully healed. I never returned to that trail, and I never forgot the way the forest seemed to shift around me, as if it had a memory and I had trespassed on it, even briefly. The story was over in a literal sense, but the experience stayed, vivid and unresolved, a real, undeniable weight that taught me that nature can be stranger than any story we tell ourselves. I had planned the hike as a way to escape the constant pressure of grad school, a solo trip into the woods to clear my mind and feel a sense of control over something tangible. The morning was cool, the air crisp with the faint scent of wet leaves and pine sap. I started early, before the sun fully broke through the canopy, so the forest was draped in a muted, green-gray light that shifted with every step I took. The trail was narrow and winding, lined with thick roots that snaked across the ground like veins, and fallen leaves that muffled the occasional snap of twigs beneath my boots. The quiet was complete, almost tangible, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. At first, the solitude was comforting. Every exhale seemed to dissolve into the stillness around me, and I focused on the rhythm of my boots, the soft swish of fabric as I adjusted my backpack, the occasional flutter of birds breaking the silence for brief, sharp moments. The trail rose gradually, cutting through dense underbrush and clusters of birch that let only streaks of light filter through. Shadows clung to the ground and the roots, shifting with the slow movement of the wind. I could feel the tension in my shoulders slowly ease, replaced by the steady beat of my heart in time with my steps. After about an hour, I noticed it. At first, it was subtle, a slight echo, the kind that could be mistaken for my own boots hitting the ground in quick succession. Then it became unmistakable. Footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate, matching mine perfectly. I stopped for a moment, listening, trying to convince myself it was someone else on the trail, another hiker moving at the same pace. But there had been no sign of anyone ahead of me, and the trail was remote, rarely used. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was nothing, that the forest was amplifying some sound, that maybe a deer or another animal was moving in a strange rhythm, but the sound persisted. Each footfall was deliberate, measured, echoing mine exactly. I picked up my pace. The leaves crunched under my boots faster, and the footsteps behind me quickened in perfect synchrony. My heart started to beat against my ribs, a dull drum that seemed to mix with the sound of the leaves and the rhythm of someone, or something, matching my movement exactly. My eyes flicked over the trail, scanning for any hint of another person. A backpack, a flash of movement, a shadow slipping behind a tree. There was nothing. The forest was still. The only sound was the echo of my own panicked breathing and the relentless footsteps that refused to fall out of time with mine. I broke into a run, forcing my legs to move faster than they had in months. The trail narrowed further, roots jutting out sharply, and my hands instinctively reached for balance, catching on low branches as I pushed ahead. The footsteps behind me accelerated without hesitation, never faltering, never breaking the rhythm, never giving me even a moment to convince myself I was imagining it. Fear had replaced the calm I had carried into the forest. My thoughts focused entirely on moving forward, outrunning the invisible presence behind me. Suddenly, the trail opened into a small clearing. Sunlight spilled across a patch of grass and wildflowers, stark against the dense trees that framed it. I skidded to a stop, chest heaving, sweat dampening the collar of my shirt. The moment my feet hit the soft grass, the footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence returned, heavy and complete, pressing against my ears in a way that made my own heartbeat seem loud. I froze, scanning the clearing, my eyes darting along the edges where the shadows stretched out like dark fingers. There was nothing. No figure, no shadow, no movement. The dirt along the edge of the clearing was undisturbed. No footprints to mark the passage of whoever or whatever had been pacing me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, muscles tense, ears straining for any sound that might indicate I had imagined the steps. The forest around me was quiet in the same way it had been when I first arrived, serene and undisturbed. The sun had climbed slightly higher, brushing through the treetops, and yet the fear lingered, thick and insistent. I walked carefully through the clearing, scanning the perimeter, but there was nothing to explain the perfect imitation of my own movements that had accompanied me down the trail. Every instinct in my body screamed that someone had been behind me, close enough to match my pace, but the physical evidence was gone. I began to make my way back down the trail, slower this time, eyes glued to the ground. Every branch snap, every rustle of leaves, made my heart jump, but there were no more footsteps, no sign of anyone following. The forest seemed unchanged, familiar in its quiet, and yet my perception of it had shifted. The trees no longer seemed like a peaceful refuge, but like silent witnesses to something inexplicable. I kept my backpack strapped tight, hands hovering near the straps as I walked, ready to react if anything appeared. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had fully risen, illuminating the parking lot with normalcy that felt jarring. Cars were scattered sparsely, people moving about in mundane routines, and the forest behind them looked ordinary, almost benign. I stood for a moment, taking deep breaths, trying to shake the memory of the footsteps and the impossible synchronization. I replayed it repeatedly, each time hoping to find a logical explanation. Another hiker timing their steps with mine, a sound bouncing oddly in the trees, some strange acoustic effect. But nothing fit. The pace had been deliberate, matched perfectly, and it had stopped only when I entered the clearing, as if whoever it was had decided their task was complete. I drove back to my apartment in silence, the city feeling unervingly close after hours in the isolated woods. By the time I unpacked, the adrenaline had subsided enough to let me think more clearly, and the incident became a puzzle I kept turning over in my mind. The only reasonable conclusion I could reach was that someone had been on the trail, hidden, deliberately pacing me, timing their steps with mine. There were no traces left behind, perhaps because the ground was soft, perhaps because they were careful, practiced. The realization settled into my chest with a weight I couldn't ignore. Someone had been stalking me in a quiet, precise, almost methodical way, and I had survived only because the trail had opened into a clearing at the right moment. I didn't return to that trail. I avoided solitary hikes for months, sticking to well-trafficked areas, always conscious of who or what might be moving behind me. The memory of those steps stayed, unrelenting, every rustle in the leaves triggering the echo of perfect imitation. Over time, I accepted that I would never understand fully what happened, but I could hold on to the certainty that the forest, for all its calm and beauty, had concealed someone capable of following me without leaving a trace. The fear was tangible, grounded in reality, and it remained, a reminder that even familiar, peaceful places can harbor silent, deliberate danger, and that sometimes being watched is more terrifying than any story could make it. We set out early, backpacks loaded, spirits high, following a trail that wound through dense forest and along narrow ridges. The hike was meant to be a multi-day excursion, a chance to disconnect from our routines and test ourselves in a place where cell service was scarce and the world beyond the trees felt distant. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles, and the sunlight filtered unevenly through the canopy, creating shifting patches of warmth on the ground. The trail was quiet except for the constant crunch of boots over leaves and pine cones, the occasional snapping of a branch underfoot. On the first day, everything felt normal. We stopped for lunch on a moss-covered outcrop that overlooked a small valley. I unpacked my bag, pulling out water and snacks, and when I reached back, a water bottle was missing. I assumed I had left it behind or that someone had moved it without thinking. We joked about it, laughing and attributing it to careless packing or the forest claiming its share of our supplies. By the time we reached the second campsite, another water bottle was gone, along with a small bag of trail mix. The pattern continued in a subtle way, items disappearing at every break, nothing of major value, always small, everyday things. I started to notice a change in the forest as well. It felt heavier somehow, more enclosing. The trees seemed taller, their trunks darker, the shadows denser and longer than they should have been at that hour. The wind shifted unexpectedly in narrow corridors, carrying a whispering sound that could have been leaves or an animal moving, but there was no rustle of brush or snapping of twigs to indicate passage. I felt watched at times, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, but I couldn't tell by what or whom. My friends were oblivious, laughing at minor inconveniences and joking about the haunted trail idea we teased each other with. By mid-afternoon on the second day, the unease became harder to ignore. I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape slipping between the trees, moving with the same rhythm as our group. It wasn't sudden, like a deer fleeing, and it didn't dart in erratic patterns. It mirrored our pace, keeping distance but following us steadily. I stopped, frozen, my heart catching in my chest, but when I turned fully, there was nothing. No shape, no person, no animal. The forest had returned to silence. I glanced at my friends, but they were miles ahead in thought and stride, moving as if nothing had shifted. We stopped for water at a narrow stream, taking care to rest on the rocks while checking packs and supplies. Another snack was missing, a small map gone from the top pocket of my friend's pack. It was frustrating, but the pattern of absence was unsettling. Nothing else had disappeared. No tents, no jackets, no valuables. The items were small, portable, seemingly random. I considered the possibility of small animals or a clever bird, but the thought never felt satisfying. The forest felt too large, too complex, and too quiet for such precise theft. As the day wore on, the shadows grew longer, stretching across the trail in ways that made distance harder to judge. The air seemed to thicken, humid and earthy, carrying a faint metallic scent that I couldn't identify. The forest was alive, but not in the way one expects. There was no wildlife visible beyond a few birds in high branches, no scurrying creatures along the underbrush, only the sense of being watched and followed. I kept catching glimpses of movement, subtle but deliberate, always at the edge of vision, always in rhythm with us, but never close enough to identify. By evening, we reached the location we had planned to camp. Normally, we would have set up our tents near the stream, but the area felt wrong. The trees pressed in closely, the underbrush thick and uneven, the shadows clinging to every depression in the ground. My friends were eager to set up, but I insisted we move further off-trail, toward a flatter clearing I had spotted earlier. The sense of unease had become overwhelming. Every time I glanced behind, the forest seemed to shift, the darkness between trunks deepening unnaturally. We walked cautiously, following a narrow path that wasn't on the map, the snow, where it had accumulated, softening our footfalls. The forest seemed to breathe around us, the sound of distant branches swaying and the low hum of wind through the canopy creating a rhythm that matched our own movement. The shadows moved subtly, stretching and folding in ways that made it impossible to discern shapes from tree trunks, and I kept imagining the dark figure I had glimpsed earlier, pacing us just beyond the edge of perception. We finally found a clearing that offered a place to set up camp, a flat area with enough space for tents and a fire ring. We worked quickly, still tense, aware that night was falling, and the forest's oppressive quiet deepened. Every sound, the scraping of poles, the rustle of canvas, the snapping of small twigs, sounded amplified, reverberating through the trees. When we were done, I lingered at the edge of the clearing, scanning the darkness beyond, convinced I was being watched. The feeling never left me. Whatever had been pacing us during the day, whatever had moved silently between trees, had not revealed itself but had made its presence known in the smallest, most deliberate ways. The night was long, the wind rising in gusts that rattled branches and sent leaves skittering across the snow-dusted ground. I kept my pack close, checking the perimeter of the clearing repeatedly, imagining movement in every shadow, every swaying branch. The sense of being observed did not fade. By morning, we packed quickly and returned to the main trail, still uneasy, every step measured, eyes constantly scanning the forest behind us. Back at the trailhead, the forest seemed innocuous, ordinary in the morning light, but I knew better. The unease I had carried for 2 days did not dissipate. The pattern of missing items, the glimpses of movement, the deliberate pacing, all suggested intelligence, careful observation, and intent. The woods had a rhythm we had entered, a presence that moved within it with purpose, and we had been caught in that rhythm without fully realizing it. I never returned to that trail, and I avoided multi-day hikes in that region for years. The memory of the forest, the way it had watched, the small disappearances, and the shadow moving just out of reach, stayed with me. It was not supernatural, not inexplicable in a mystical sense, but it was real, deliberate, and unervingly precise. The forest had revealed its presence without confrontation, leaving evidence in absence and movement. It was a reminder that the wilderness can harbor intelligence, patient and subtle, and that even the most careful observer can feel entirely exposed in its depths. I had set out early that morning, camera in hand, determined to capture the snow-capped peaks in the late afternoon light. The trailhead was quiet, the air thin and cold, and the sky a pale blue that promised clear weather. The snow underfoot was soft in the sun, crunchy where it had frozen overnight, and the forest ahead loomed darkly despite the light. I had gone alone, as I often did, seeking the kind of solitude that allowed me to focus on framing the perfect shot, the way the peaks caught the sunlight, the shadows tracing the contours of the mountains. The hike started easily enough. I moved carefully, scanning the slopes for angles, stopping periodically to take photographs, crouching low to get the best foreground for the peaks. The air smelled sharp, a mixture of pine, melting snow, and the faint tang of minerals from rocks exposed along the trail. I kept track of landmarks, the fork in the trail where a fallen tree blocked part of the path, the small rock outcrop where the snow melted unevenly. But after several hours of moving deeper into the forest, I realized I had lost the trail entirely. The markers I had followed earlier were hidden under fresh snow, and the surrounding trees looked unfamiliar. The sun was falling fast, and the light had changed from a pale blue to gold, then pink and finally a muted gray. As the shadows grew longer, I tried retracing my steps, but everything was distorted by the failing light. The snow, soft and deceptive, left footprints that blurred quickly as I moved, and the slope of the ground concealed the terrain ahead. I pressed forward, careful with every step, but my anxiety began to rise. The silence around me was complete, broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots and the occasional distant crack of ice falling from a tree branch. I had my headlamp, but I didn't want to use it yet, preferring the natural light, though it was fading faster than I expected. It was then that I noticed it. A red glow moving between the trees, subtle at first, like a faint ember caught in the wind. I stopped, scanning the area. The glow hovered behind thick trunks and patches of snow, moving steadily along what appeared to be another path. My first thought was a hiker in trouble, someone with a lantern or emergency light. I raised my voice, calling out, though my words barely carried through the dense forest. There was no answer. The glow continued, bobbing slightly, and I moved toward it cautiously, slipping on icy patches of snow, brushing past low branches that scraped my jacket and backpack. Every step felt deliberate, tense. I expected to see another person emerge, someone equally relieved to find company. But the trees remained silent. The glow shifted between trees and behind snow-laden shrubs, sometimes obscured entirely, then suddenly visible again. I followed it, moving through drifts of snow that rose above my boots, my camera swinging awkwardly against my chest. My breaths formed clouds in the air, and the sound of snow underfoot was loud in the oppressive silence. I kept imagining someone had lost a light, a lantern carried by a hiker who had gone off trail. But each time I paused, the glow seemed to drift further, maintaining distance. The forest grew darker, thicker, the trees spaced closer together, their trunks rough against my gloved hands as I passed. I slipped several times, catching myself on branches or uneven rocks hidden beneath snow, and every time I looked back, the red glow was gone, only to appear again slightly off to one side, still moving deliberately. My pulse was steady but tense, my mind racing with possibilities. It wasn't the glow itself that unsettled me. It was the way it moved, smooth, measured, almost intelligent. It didn't behave like a hiker fumbling in snow or trying to find the trail. Its motion was too deliberate, too precise to be accidental. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, the glow vanished entirely. I stumbled through dense snow, exhausted, careful with each step, unsure whether to retrace my path or push forward blindly. The light of the setting sun had faded completely, leaving only a deep, cold gray that pressed in from every direction. The trees closed around me, their silhouettes jagged and oppressive. My breathing was loud, each exhale sounding strange and amplified in the silence. I realized I had no sense of direction, only instinct telling me to move downhill, toward where I hoped the trailhead was located. Eventually, after hours of stumbling through snow, slipping over rocks, and brushing past frozen shrubs, I emerged from the forest into a familiar clearing. My boots sank into the snow, and the sight of the distant peaks, now tinged with the first faint light of evening, anchored me in reality. I realized I had been walking in loops, drawn deeper into the trees by the red glow that had appeared and vanished, and yet there was no trace of anyone else. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing to suggest another person had been in the forest at all. My heart was still racing, muscles tense, adrenaline fading slowly into a weary, hollow exhaustion. I spent some time on the edge of the clearing, looking back into the forest, trying to rationalize what I had seen. There was no evidence that anyone else had been there, no trail markers or tracks beyond my own. And yet the movement of the red glow was real in my memory, deliberate and impossible to dismiss. I realized that whatever I had followed, whatever had guided me through the darkness, had not been human. The motion was intentional, precise, and unaccompanied by sound beyond the faint whisper of snow underfoot. It wasn't just that I had been alone. It was that I had been observed, tracked, led through the forest by something that moved like a person but was not one. By the time I made it back to the car, the sky was dark, stars faint against the winter haze, and my hands were numb from cold. I drove home in silence, my mind replaying the red glow, the way it had moved through the trees, the way I had instinctively followed it, hoping to find someone in need. The logical part of me kept insisting it must have been a hiker, a lantern, some trick of the light, but the way it moved was too deliberate, too methodical to be accidental. There had been no footprints, no sign of anyone else, and yet I knew I had not imagined the glow itself. The experience stayed with me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red light bobbing between dark trees, precise and purposeful. I avoided winter hikes for a time, returning to familiar trails in daylight, but the memory never faded. I came to accept that what I had followed was real, something capable of movement and observation, and yet not human. The rational explanations, other hikers' reflections, tricks of snow and light, could not account for the precision of its motion, the way it had disappeared entirely, leaving me alone in the silent forest. The lesson I took from it was clear. Even in familiar landscapes, in conditions that seem controlled and predictable, there are elements beyond human comprehension, movement that can be deliberate and watchful without leaving any trace. I had walked into the forest for solitude and photographs, seeking clarity, but I left with the vivid certainty that observation in wilderness does not always come from other people. I had been followed, paced, and guided by something deliberate, and the forest itself had returned me, shaken, to the edge of familiarity. The red glow was gone, but the knowledge of it remained, precise, deliberate, and unsettlingly real. I had chosen that trail for the challenge, a steep ascent that wound along the side of a narrow ridge, rocky and exposed, with views of the valley far below. I had done similar climbs before, but something about this one felt different from the start. The slope was sharper, the loose stones more numerous, and the air thinner, carrying a sharp chill that settled in my lungs. I moved carefully, boots crunching over gravel and larger rocks, hands brushing against rough bark or grabbing at jagged outcrops for balance. The sun was high, but the canyon's walls cast long shadows across the trail, making it difficult to gauge the steepness in some places. At first, the climb went as expected. I stopped periodically to adjust my pack and catch my breath, noting the way the valley opened below me, the forest a deep green carpet that stretched to the distant ridges. The trail was narrow, barely more than a footpath, and in spots the rock jutted out sharply, forcing me to step carefully or risk a fall. I was alert, scanning the terrain for loose stones or uneven footing, aware that one misstep could have consequences. The wind rose occasionally, rattling loose branches and causing small stones to skitter down the slope. Then it happened. My foot slipped on a patch of gravel that gave way beneath my weight. Instinctively, I grabbed at the closest outcrop, but the sudden slide of stones sent me tumbling a few feet down the slope. My hands scraped against rough rock, my backpack swinging sharply and pulling against my shoulders. Small stones clattered and bounced, some falling into the void below, creating a short, sharp cascade that echoed off the canyon walls. My heart raced as I fought to regain footing, the slope giving way with every movement, my fingers raw and aching from the effort to cling to anything solid. I found a narrow ledge that offered just enough space to press myself against the rock face. My chest heaved, arms trembling as I grasped at the jagged surface to steady myself. From that precarious perch, I looked upward, expecting to see the trail I had just lost. That's when I noticed the footprints. Heavy, booted, unmistakably human, pressed deep into the loose soil and gravel of the incline. The prints were not mine. Their shape, size, and depth were different, with a confident weight to each step that suggested someone capable and experienced. They led along the path I had just struggled over, and then, abruptly, they ended at the edge of a cliff. I froze, heart hammering, my mind trying to reconcile what I was seeing. No one was there. No figure appeared above the cliff. No movement in the trees or rocks. No sound of a voice or footsteps coming down to help or warn me. The prints were heavy, deliberate, yet there was no trace of the person who had made them. The thought occurred to me that someone had been there, observing my climb and possibly testing the limits of my balance, or worse, letting the stones give way to see what I would do. My fingers dug into the ledge, knuckles white, my breathing harsh and shallow. I took a careful step to reposition myself, finding a slightly more secure grip on the rock. The ledge was narrow, barely wider than my boots, but it held. Each movement required careful calculation. Hands and feet moving in sequence, avoiding loose stones that might trigger another small slide. My mind was sharp with tension, every sense heightened. I could hear the distant rush of the valley stream far below, the wind skimming across the ridge, the faint creak of a tree branch swaying somewhere on the slope above me. The forest was silent otherwise, the absence of any other human presence weighing heavily in the silence. Step by careful step, I made my way back toward the trail I had initially slipped from. The gravel shifted under my weight, forcing me to adjust constantly, my muscles straining to maintain balance. Every instinct screamed caution, every nerve alert to the slightest movement in the rock or brush around me. The prints lingered in my mind, their sudden disappearance at the cliff's edge replaying over and over. It was as if whoever had made them had timed their exit perfectly, leaving no trace and no explanation. By the time I reached solid ground at the top of the incline, my legs were trembling from exertion and adrenaline. I paused, pressing my palms against my thighs, breathing in ragged gasps, eyes scanning the cliff edge where the footprints ended. There was nothing. The drop was sheer, unforgiving, and completely inaccessible. The prints had stopped, leaving only the barren rock face. I traced the path with my gaze repeatedly, trying to convince myself it was some natural formation or trick of the gravel. But each print was too precise, too human in proportion, depth, and spacing. I descended the rest of the trail cautiously, though my mind remained tense. Every shadow, every shifting patch of gravel, felt like it could be evidence of observation. I replayed the climb endlessly, imagining someone pacing above, studying each step, gauging my balance, perhaps even hoping I would fall. It was impossible to know whether it had been deliberate or coincidental, but the thought persisted, that I had not been alone, that my movements had been watched by someone with awareness and skill. The forest, which had felt serene before, now seemed larger, more oppressive, as though each tree and boulder could conceal a presence ready to test the limits of my caution. When I finally reached the lower trail, where the incline leveled and gravel gave way to packed dirt and vegetation, the tension began to ease, though the unease never fully left. I paused to look back up at the slope I had navigated, the cliff where the footprints ended, and felt a lingering chill. The climb had been real, the slip unavoidable, the danger present in every rock and crevice, but the prints suggested someone else had been there, observing and perhaps evaluating. I could not shake the certainty that my misstep had been noted, that I had been watched, and that the observer had left without a trace, leaving only the evidence of their boots pressed into the earth. By the time I reached the trailhead, where other hikers were moving in familiar, safe patterns, the adrenaline had faded into a lingering tension. My hands were still shaky from gripping the rock ledge, my legs sore from the climb, but my mind remained alert, replaying the footprints, the cliff, the silence. I understood fully that no one had confronted me, no one had interfered directly, yet the presence had been undeniable. In the days that followed, I thought often of that climb. The forest was the same as it had been before, quiet, beautiful, challenging, but I could no longer view it without the awareness that someone might have been watching, deliberately and carefully. The prints remained in my mind as evidence of observation, a tangible proof that my solo hike had not been as solitary as I had believed. I never returned to that trail, and every steep incline I attempted afterward carried the memory of that cliff, the missing observer, and the unshakable feeling that the wilderness can contain not just natural danger, but the careful, watchful presence of another human. I went hiking that day because I needed to move. Quitting my job had left me restless in a way sleep could not fix. My body felt heavy from weeks of sitting, and my thoughts kept circling the same dead ends. The trail along the ridge was one I had walked before, familiar enough to feel safe, remote enough to be quiet. I parked at a gravel pullout just after mid-morning. The sky was pale and cloudless. The air held that dry, sharp smell of pine needles warming in the sun. I shouldered a small pack, locked the car, and stepped onto the path. The first mile felt normal. The ground was packed dirt with scattered stones, narrow but steady. The ridge rose on my left and dropped away on my right into a long sweep of forest. I focused on my breathing and the rhythm of my steps. My phone stayed in my pocket. I wanted distance from everything that made noise. The trail usually carried sound well. Wind moved through the treetops. Birds called from the brush. Insects buzzed low and steady. That day, none of it was there. I noticed the quiet without understanding it at first. It felt like walking into a room after music had stopped. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have. Each crunch of gravel carried too far, then fell dead. I paused, listening. The air was still. Leaves did not move. The forest looked unchanged, but it felt paused, like a held breath. I told myself it was just a lull. Animals move in cycles. Wind comes and goes. I kept walking. The ridge narrowed as the trail climbed. The trees grew thinner and shorter, twisted by years of exposure. The ground dropped more steeply on the right. I could see long stretches of forest below, broken by patches of bare rock. I felt exposed, small against the open sky. The silence followed me uphill. About 20 minutes later, I heard something behind me. It was faint at first, more a sense than a sound. A soft movement just outside my awareness. I slowed my pace, letting my steps soften. The sound stayed. It rose and fell, uneven, like breath pushed through teeth. I stopped and turned. The trail behind me was empty. The path curved away, lined with scrub and stone. Nothing moved. No one stood there. I waited, listening. The sound faded. I told myself it was wind slipping through a crack in the rocks. Ridges create strange currents. Sound travels oddly along them. I resumed walking. The whispers returned a few minutes later. This time they were clearer. Not loud, not sharp, but shaped. They carried rhythm. Pauses. A rise at the end of each phrase. They came from behind me again, low and close, as if someone were just out of sight, careful not to be seen. I stopped and turned faster. The trail was still empty. My chest tightened. My pulse picked up. I stood still, scanning the brush, the bends in the trail, the drop-off. I listened harder. The sound came again, softer now, as if receding. It seemed to slide along the ridge instead of moving straight back. I told myself I was stressed. I had not slept well in weeks. My mind was tired. The human brain looks for patterns even when none exist. I knew that. I used that knowledge to push forward. As I walked, I noticed the whispers did not follow a steady path. Sometimes they felt close, almost at my shoulder. Other times they seemed far off, carried upward from below. They never came from the same direction twice in a row. Each time I turned, they vanished. I picked up my pace. My breathing grew louder. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck. The trail ahead stretched longer than I remembered. The silence pressed in, broken only by my movement and the soft sounds that followed me. The whispers began to feel urgent. Not louder, but tighter. They seemed to rush, overlapping in a way that made my skin prickle. I could not make out full sentences, but I caught fragments. Sharp starts, sudden stops, the kind of sound people make when they are trying to be quiet but cannot stop talking. I told myself it could be hikers somewhere below, voices carrying up the slope. Sound can travel far in the right conditions. A ridge can act like a channel. I tried to believe that. I scanned the forest below for movement, flashes of color, anything that would anchor the sound to a source. I saw nothing. The trail crested and flattened. The ridge widened slightly, offering a small stretch of open ground. I stepped onto it and felt exposed. The whispers came again, closer than before. My shoulders tightened. I turned slowly, forcing myself not to panic. The path behind me was still empty. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing. I realized then that the forest was not silent anymore. It was listening. That thought settled heavy in my chest. I did not want to be there. I wanted to be back at my car, back in a place with clear edges and known sounds. I started moving faster, no longer caring about my breathing or the noise I made. The whispers followed, keeping pace. They rose when I slowed, faded when I sped up, as if reacting to me. That made it worse. It made them feel aware. The trail began its descent toward the parking area. My legs burned from the pace. My mind raced through explanations, grabbing at anything solid. Wind, acoustics, stress, fatigue. I focused on the ground in front of me, placing each step with care. As I dropped lower, the forest changed. Trees grew thicker. The air felt heavier. The whispers shifted too. They became more scattered, less shaped. The urgency drained from them, replaced by something flatter, more mechanical. I reached a bend where the trail cut close to the ridge face. The rock wall rose on my left, smooth and pale. As I passed it, the sound sharpened suddenly, echoing off the stone. For a brief moment, it felt as if the whispers were everywhere at once, bouncing and folding in on themselves. I stopped dead. My hands shook. My mouth felt dry. Then, beneath the layered sound, I heard something else. Faint, rhythmic crackle. Not natural, regular, electrical. I listened harder, forcing my breathing to slow. The whispers were still there, but now I could hear gaps between them. Static, bursts, the rise and fall of transmission. Understanding came slowly, settling into place as my fear eased. Somewhere along the ridge, out of sight, people were using handheld radios. The terrain was carrying their signals in strange ways, breaking their words into fragments, sending them skipping along the rock and trees. The silence I had noticed earlier made it worse. With no wind, no birds, nothing to mask the sound, every transmission stood out. The urgency I had felt was not intent. It was distortion. Radio voices clipped by distance and interference, stripped of context, turned into whispers by the landscape. I started walking again, slower now. As I descended further, the sound thinned. The crackle faded. The whispers lost shape and dissolved into nothing. The forest sounds returned in pieces. A bird called from deep in the trees. Leaves rustled as a breeze finally reached the slope. When I reached the parking area, the trail opened onto the gravel lot. 2 trucks were parked at the far end, dusty and plain. No one stood nearby. The whispers were gone. I unlocked my car and sat inside for a long moment, hands on the wheel, listening. Wind moved through the trees. An insect buzzed near the windshield. Everything sounded normal again. Later, after I drove home, I looked up the area online. I found a notice about a search and rescue training exercise scheduled for that weekend, covering several ridges and valleys. Volunteers using radios to coordinate movement. The timing matched my hike. The explanation settled something inside me. It did not erase the memory, but it gave it edges. I understood how stress and silence had sharpened the sound, how my own fear had filled the gaps. I knew why the whispers had followed me, why they had felt close without ever revealing a source. Even now, when I think about that hike, my chest tightens a little. Not because I believe something watched me, but because I remember how easily my mind turned uncertainty into threat. The ridge did not hide anything waiting for me. It only carried what was already there, bending it until it felt personal. I chose that trail because it was new to me. I had hiked the area for years, enough to feel steady on my feet and calm in my head. That morning, I wanted something unfamiliar without being reckless. The map showed a loop that climbed a ridge, dipped into a long basin, then followed a creek back to the trailhead. It was rated moderate, clear weather, no storms in the forecast. I parked at a gravel pullout with only one other car, old and dusted, plates from another state. I shouldered my pack, checked water, checked boots, checked my compass out of habit, and started in. The trail looked right. Packed dirt, cut back brush, blazes on trees. The forest was mixed pine and hardwood, open enough to see distance between trunks. The air smelled dry and clean. The light filtered in clean lines. My pace was easy. I remember thinking it felt like a place meant to be crossed, not admired, a corridor built for movement. That thought stayed with me longer than it should have. About an hour in, the trail bent around a low rise and the sign came into view, or what was left of it. The post was snapped near the ground, splintered as if twisted, not chopped. The board lay in pieces scattered across the dirt. The paint was scraped deep, not just peeled. Long marks cut into the wood. At first I thought animals, antlers, or teeth. Then I saw the marks ran in lines, some straight, some curved. They crossed each other with a kind of spacing that made my eyes search for sense. Letters want to be read. My mind tried. I crouched and moved a piece with my glove. The scratches could have been random damage from weather and boots, but they did not feel random. The grooves had pressure at the start and lift at the end, like someone dragging metal across grain. I stood there longer than planned, scanning the trees, listening for wind or movement. Nothing stood out. The forest felt paused, like a held breath. I set the sign pieces back as they were. I told myself people vandalize things. A broken sign did not mean danger. Still, I checked my compass. The needle swung, slowed, then spun a full circle before settling. I tapped it, held it away from my body. It spun again, jittery, then pointed somewhere different than before. I knew this area had iron-rich rock. I had read about it causing odd readings. I took out the map and oriented by landmarks instead. The ridge was to my left. The sun was high and clear. I pressed on. The trail narrowed. Blazes appeared less often. The ground changed from dirt to crushed rock, then back again. I crossed a dry wash that was marked on the map as a creek. The bed was wide and bare. No recent water. The loop should have dropped after that, but the path kept climbing. The grade was gentle, steady, the kind that fools the legs. I checked the map again. The line showed a descent. I told myself the map was old. Trails get rerouted. I trusted the tread under my boots more than ink. I noticed the same bent tree twice. A pine with a scar where lightning had peeled bark. The first time I passed it, I made a mental note because it stood close to the trail. The second time, it was on my right again, same angle, same scar, same fallen branch at its base. I stopped and turned slowly. The trail behind me looked familiar in a way that felt wrong. It curved the same way, with the same stones, the same shallow rut. I walked back a dozen steps and then forward again. The tree did not move. My chest tightened, then loosened as reason stepped in. Switchbacks can do that. Loops overlap. Memory plays tricks when tired. I took out the compass again. The needle spun. I held it still, tried to shield it. It refused to settle. I put it away and relied on the sun. Hours had passed. Shadows lengthened. The basin should have opened by now. Instead, the forest closed in. Underbrush thickened. The trail showed more boot prints than expected, then fewer. In places it vanished into leaf litter and picked up again 10 steps later, as if walked by someone unsure of direction. I reached a junction that was not on the map. 3 paths met at a flat, trampled circle. No signpost, no blazes. The ground was chewed up by boots turning in place. I chose the left path because it followed the slope I expected. After 10 minutes, I hit the same junction again. The same circle, the same scuffed dirt. I stood there longer this time, listening. Wind moved high above, but nothing else. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by the weight of the place, the way pressure builds before rain. I tried the right path. It dipped sharply, crossed wet ground, then climbed. The soil turned dark. Roots crossed like ribs. I slipped once and scraped my palm. The path narrowed to a game trail. Then it widened again and I found myself at the same circle. My own fresh boot prints crossing older ones. I looked at the sky. The light had changed. The sun slid low, filtered by trunks. Evening comes fast under trees. I knew then I was not following a maintained trail. Whether from erosion, poor mapping, or people cutting shortcuts, I was inside a knot of paths that fed back into themselves. Panic rose clean and sharp. I forced it down by routine. I sat, drank water, ate a bar. I marked the ground with a stick, a simple arrow pointing to the path I had come from. Then I chose the third path. That path ran level and straight for longer than the others. It felt promising. The forest thinned. I could see a darker band ahead that might be the creek. My pace quickened. I crossed a fallen log and almost missed the turn where the trail bent hard right. When I followed it, the ground changed again and the smell shifted, damp and metallic. The compass spun in my pocket, clicking softly as I walked. I took it out and laughed once, short and dry, at how useless it was. Night came while I was still moving. Not full dark at first, just the loss of detail. Trunks became columns. Gaps closed. I turned on my headlamp and the beam cut a narrow tunnel through leaves. My breath sounded loud. I slowed to avoid mistakes. I kept expecting to hit the creek, a road, anything linear. Instead, the path looped back on itself again. I saw my arrow scratched in dirt and felt a cold settle in my stomach. I took out my phone. There was signal enough to load GPS, a thin blue dot on a pale map. The dot drifted. The track showed me walking in circles inside a blank green area. No trails marked. The map was less detailed than the paper one. Still, it showed a road half a mile east. I turned and started toward it, ignoring the path, pushing through brush when needed, keeping the phone held out like a fragile promise. The forest resisted in small ways. Thorns caught my sleeves. Deadfall forced detours. The ground sloped unexpectedly and then leveled, as if the land itself was folded. The blue dot jumped. I stopped often to let it settle. Each time it did, the road stayed east. I kept going. I broke out onto a cut line just before full dark. It was narrow, straight, and bare, likely an old logging boundary. I followed it north because the map showed it would meet the road. My legs shook with fatigue and relief. After 10 minutes, headlights flared through trees. I reached the road and stood there breathing, letting the sound of tires ground me. I walked the shoulder back to the pullout. The old car was gone. My own sat alone. I dropped my pack and leaned against the door until my hands stopped shaking. When I drove home, I replayed the day in pieces, searching for mistakes. Later, I studied maps online. The loop had been rerouted years ago due to erosion and private land access. Several unofficial paths braided the area, cut by hikers trying to find shortcuts. The smash sign had been removed and replaced more than once. The rock under that ridge held enough iron to scramble compasses. The GPS track showed a tight spiral where the paths overlapped. None of that erased the feeling. The forest did not move. I did. I followed lines that led back to themselves. I trusted tools without understanding their limits. The place was not malicious. It was indifferent, shaped by weather, rock, and human feet. That knowledge should have comforted me. It did not. When I hike now, I carry 2 maps, mark my route early, and turn back sooner. I pass that pullout sometimes and keep driving because I know how easy it is for a familiar place to close quietly around a person who keeps walking. I chose that trail because it was supposed to be boring. A long out and back through state land that followed an old logging route. Nothing scenic enough to attract crowds. I wanted quiet and distance. Something that would keep my legs moving while my head emptied itself. I parked at a gravel pull-off just after sunrise. The air still cold enough to sting my lungs. The forest dark and wet from overnight rain. The trailhead sign was faded and leaning. No fresh tire tracks. No other cars. That suited me. I checked my pack, locked the car, and stepped onto the trail. The ground was soft and uneven, packed dirt layered with wet needles. My boots sank slightly with each step. The forest closed in fast. Tall pines on both sides, trunks dark and straight, branches high enough to block most of the light. Everything smelled like rot and water. The only sound at first was my breathing and the steady crunch of my steps. About 30 minutes in, I noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but empty. No birds, no insects, no wind moving the canopy. The forest felt paused. I kept walking, telling myself it was early, that the rain had pushed things into hiding. The trail followed a shallow ridge, climbing slowly. On my map, it was marked as maintained, but I could tell it hadn't seen work in a long time. Fallen branches lay across it. Brush pressed in from the sides. In places, the path thinned to a faint depression in the ground. I paid attention to my footing, watching for slick rocks and exposed roots. An hour in, I saw the first sign that someone else had been there. A footprint pressed deep into the mud just off the trail. Larger than mine. The tread was sharp, recent. I stopped and looked around. The forest beyond the trail was dense, but not impassable. No movement, no sound. I assumed another hiker had passed earlier, maybe before the rain fully stopped. I kept going. As the trail climbed higher, the trees thinned slightly, replaced by younger growth and patches of exposed rock. The air felt colder. My breath fogged faintly. I checked my watch. Still early. I had plenty of daylight. Then I noticed the trash. At first it was small. A torn corner of plastic half buried in mud. A crushed aluminum can deeper in the brush. Not the kind of litter that comes from casual hikers. These items looked dragged, stepped on, worked into the ground. I told myself it was old. I told myself people dump things everywhere. The trail bent sharply left, then right, following the ridge. In one of those bends, I saw something that made me stop completely. A pile of clothing. It sat about 20 feet off the trail, arranged in a loose heap against a fallen log. A jacket, jeans, a shirt, all adult-sized, all soaked through and darkened with mud. No leaves had settled on top of them yet. They hadn't been there long. I stood still and listened. My pulse felt loud in my ears. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved. The silence felt heavier now, pressing in. I didn't touch the clothes. I didn't step closer. I backed away until I was back on the trail. I told myself someone might have changed after getting wet. I told myself there were explanations. I kept walking, but slower now. The ridge narrowed ahead. The trail dropped into a shallow cut where water had eroded the ground. The sides rose steeply, packed with roots and stones. As I moved through it, I felt exposed, boxed in. My pack brushed the walls. Halfway through the cut, I saw marks in the dirt, long, uneven grooves running downhill, as if something heavy had been dragged. The soil was disturbed on both sides, scuffed and torn. The marks ended where the trail flattened again. I stopped there for a long time. My instincts told me to turn around. My mind argued back. I was already far in. I hadn't seen anyone. I didn't want to overreact. I kept going. The trail leveled out and widened slightly. The forest here looked different, older. The trees were thicker, their bark scarred and dark. The ground was bare in places, stripped of needles and leaves. I smelled something sour beneath the damp forest scent. That was when I found the backpack. It lay on its side just off the trail, half hidden behind a stump. A hiking pack similar to mine, but cheaper. One strap was torn clean through. The fabric was ripped open, the contents spilled out. A water bottle empty. A folded map, smeared with mud. Food wrappers unopened. I crouched near it, careful not to touch anything. The map showed the same trail I was on. A circle marked near the ridge ahead. Someone's handwriting. A note written in pen at the edge. I didn't read it closely. I didn't want to. The realization settled slowly, heavy and cold. This wasn't abandoned gear. This was dropped, lost, or left behind in a hurry. I stood up and turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. My skin prickled. I felt watched, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet certainty that comes from being exposed. The forest still didn't move. No birds broke the silence. No wind. I made the decision then to turn back. As soon as I did, the trail looked different. Narrower, less clear. The bends seemed sharper, the distance longer. I walked faster, my steps uneven. That was when I noticed the footprints again. Not just one set this time, several. Heavy boot prints crossing the trail, then following it. Some overlapping mine, some fresher. My breathing quickened. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise. I focused on steady movement, keeping my balance. Around one bend, I saw something ahead that made my stomach drop. A length of rope stretched low across the trail, tied between two trees. Not tight enough to trip someone hard, but placed deliberately at shin height. The rope was dirty, frayed in places, but strong. I stopped short and stepped back. My hands shook as I looked at it. This wasn't random. This wasn't left behind. Someone had said it. I backed away slowly, then stepped off the trail into the brush, moving wide around the rope. Branches scraped my arms. The ground sucked at my boots. I rejoined the trail several yards back, my heart pounding. From that point on, I felt exposed everywhere. Every rise felt like a blind spot. Every dip felt like a trap. I checked behind me constantly, forcing myself not to panic. The dragged marks appeared again farther down, deeper now, pressed hard into the soil. I followed them with my eyes until they vanished into thick undergrowth. I didn't stop moving. When I finally saw the trailhead sign through the trees, relief hit me so hard my knees felt weak. The forest lightened. Sounds returned faintly, distant birds, a breeze moving leaves. I stepped out of the trees and into the gravel clearing. My car was still there. Next to it was another vehicle, an old truck, mud-caked, parked crookedly across the pull-off. The driver's door stood open. The engine was cold. In the dirt between the truck and the trailhead, I saw deep boot prints, the same tread as before, leading toward the trail. And then I saw mine, overlapping them, heading back. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I unlocked my car, threw my pack inside, and drove away as fast as the road allowed. Later, after I reached cell service, I called it in. I gave the location. I described what I had seen. Search teams went out that afternoon. They found the clothes. They found the backpack. They found signs of a struggle farther along the ridge, hidden off the trail. They never released all the details, but they confirmed what I already knew. Someone had been using that trail to hunt people who wanted to be alone. The area was closed. The trail removed from maps. The pull-off filled with gravel and blocked. I still hike, but never alone, and never on trails that promise quiet. Silence in the woods no longer feels peaceful to me. It feels like a warning I almost ignored.